Hi, welcome to the Crates Motel. My name's Conan. In today's video, we're going to be looking at mixing bass in the MPC Standalone. Now, there's obviously infinite bass sounds, and if you watch my videos, you'll know that I really emphasize the fact that there's no one solution, one size fits all for mixing and mastering. So today, I'm going to be looking at some live bass and some synth bass, and I'll be covering sub basses and 808 basses in a different video. So let's jump in. So whenever you're mixing, it's always good to step away from the mix sometimes and really focus on what your objectives are, what your goals are, what you want the end result to be. It's very easy to get deep into a mix and completely lose your direction, and it's especially important with drums and also important with bass. Now, these elements are the foundations of your song, and the bass is very often the bridge between your rhythm and your melody and harmony. Generally, it needs to be tight with the rhythm. But also you're dealing with two elements in a mix that are both dominant in the low end. And you need to get a good balance between your kick, for instance, and your bass. And I'd say that's probably, in my opinion, one of the most important elements in actually mixing a track. The first thing you should ask yourself is, what do you want to be dominant in the low end? Do you want it to be your bass sound, your synth bass, your live bass, or do you want it to be the kick? Because generally you can't really have both of them being the dominant low end subs of the actual track. But if you make this decision before you start your mix, then it gives you more focus and it will help you focus more on your direction and your actual goal. So do you want the bass to be the rumbling background sound, or do you want it to cut through the mix and be actually part of the harmony and melody as well? So as I said, I'm going to be looking at some live bass today and some synth bass. Now, obviously there's an infinite amount of bass sounds, even with live bass and with synth bass, obviously. So by all means, look at my effects chain, but do bear in mind that the exact settings that I have in my effects chain are not necessarily going to translate to your exact bass sound. So by all means, follow it in a ballpark type of way, but you're going to need to dial it in to suit the actual bass sound that you're using in your song. So let's have a look at this live bass first. I've got a drum beat and just a live bass. There's no other elements to the track. So just a very simple kind of disco funk kind of track. If we go to the bass, just listen to that in solo. And then let's go into the effects chain. So if I take everything off, now obviously with a bass like this, with a live bass, you don't really want it to be really booming in the bottom end. Not on a track like this anyway. There would be instances where you would want a live bass to be a bit more boomier, but generally with something like this, a complicated live bass, you kind of want it to be able to cut through the mix. It's part of the harmony and the melody, but it's also part of the rhythm as well. So you don't want it to be clashing with your kick drum, so you don't really want them to populate the same frequency range. So you want it to cut through the mix, but you do still want it to have a nice tight low end at the same time. So I'm going to run through this particular chain on this particular bass. Let's take everything off, starting with compression. Now, the reason why, especially with live bass, and just the inherent characteristics of bass, is quite often the reason why I'll apply some compression is because I want it to sound even. I don't want it to be going up and down in volume, etc. And obviously with a live bass player, just the way that they play the bass, there's going to be fluctuations in volume. So let's just listen to that just with the compressor off. Now, one of the first things you'll notice straight away is because I've applied some compression, I have actually lost some low end. And I do actually touch on this in another video as well. And this is quite often what happens when you apply compression to low end instruments. Because more often than not, it's the low end which is activating the compressor first, and we don't have sidechain facilities on the compressors inside Akai MPCs. Hope you're listening, Akai. So what you often have to do after you've applied the compression is then add some EQ. But first we'll start with the compression. Now I've used an opto compressor. The reason is for many years, 30 plus years, whenever I've had a live bass, I've applied an LA2A or an LA3A. It's an opto compressor. It's quite a slow compressor, slow attack, slow release. It's kind of gentle, but it levels out the sound. It reels in the bass, and it still gives it a nice tight sound. So the opto compressor, I'm pretty certain, is based on the LA2A. So you can see here the settings that I've got. Now, the way I've got this set up is very similar. On an LA2A and an LA3A, you don't have separate release and attack, etc., or even ratio, come to think of it. So on here, I've set this up so it's kind of reacting in a similar way that an opto compressor would react. So it's quite a slow attack and quite a slow release. And the reason for this, especially in this particular case, is because of the way the bass is played. It's with a finger, it's not with a pick. I wanted to bring out some of the attack on the bass because that will help it cut through the mix. So with the release, it's still actually quite fast, I suppose. And with the slow attack, I'm letting the transient through, but with a semi-fast-ish, almost bordering on, let's call it middle of the road release. So it's letting some of the transient through, but then clamping down on it. So it is emphasizing the first transient of the bass notes, basically. Ratio, I've got about 5, which I'm not exactly sure how the numbers correspond. I'm fairly certain 5 is not 5 to 1, but it sounds kind of around about 3 to 1, 4 to 1. It's still quite a gentle ratio. And then I'm bringing the threshold back quite hard and then applying some output to it, keeping it 100% wet. So the aim for me on this is by shaping using the release of the attack and the ratio and the threshold is to even out the volume and add a little bit of transient, add a little bit of attack to the actual notes. So you can hear that it's emphasizing his fingers a little bit. It's almost like his fingers have hardened up a little bit, and it's less rounded and a little bit more attack. And that's going to help it cut through the mix a little bit more, because that's what I want on this particular track. That's not always the way that you're going to want it. For instance, a lot of reggae tracks, for instance, that kind of stuff, maybe some lo-fi stuff with live bass. You want the live bass to sound a bit more rounded, so that wouldn't work with this. You'd want to have a more rounded transient attack, so therefore you would have a shorter attack, so you're rounding off the transients. So this is why you need to step away from the mix. This is why you can't just go in there and just throw a compressor on and start twiddling knobs and hoping that it'll turn out right. If you step away from the mix, go and have a cup of tea or whatever. Actually, that's a valuable lesson. My mentor taught me one of the most important things working in a studio is making a cup of tea, because what it does is it takes you out of the situation. You walk away for 10-15 minutes and you're assessing what you're doing, giving yourself some direction, and then you go back to it and you can get back on the mix. If you sit in the mix too much, sometimes you can't see the wood for trees. You just start losing your direction and you step away from it after 2 or 3 hours of trying to get the attack right on a snare drum or a kick drum. You walk away, go to the toilet, for instance, you come back and it just sounds like a total mess. So having the ability to step away sometimes and assess what you're doing and make a decision on where you want your goals, what your objectives are, can sometimes be really, really useful. And it's just as important as sitting down and twiddling knobs. So I made the judgment here that I wanted a bit of attack, wanted it to cut through the mix a little bit. So I've used the compressor in this way. Now, as I said, because of the way the compressor was used, I've lost some low end. So I'm using the PEQ2 here, and I'm giving it some low end, quite a lot, you can see. It's about 93 hertz because I don't want it to clash with the kick drum, and the kick drum's around about 60 hertz. So you have to make those decisions as well. So you can hear there, what I've done by using that technique is I've got my levels, I've got my transients, and now I'm bringing back the bass into the bass that I'd lost by using the compressor. Now, with this particular bass, and this happens a lot with live bass, you get a bit of finger noise, and you get a bit of fret noise, and that is the case with this particular bass. And also because I've used the compressor and I've reduced the dynamic range, I've actually brought the noise floor up a little bit. So I've actually increased the amount of noise that I'm getting from the fingers and on the frets. And so what I've done here, and this is a trick that a lot of engineers have been using for absolutely years, is I've used a gate. And it's quite gentle, but what it's basically doing is I'm getting rid of some of the noise on the bass. So this seems quite complicated, but if you want total control of your bass, you need to know what tools to use to get that control. And in this case, as I said, it does seem quite complicated because I've gone compression, EQ, noise gate. You could say, well, if you didn't use the compressor, you wouldn't lose the low end and you wouldn't bring up the noise floor. So you wouldn't need those three effects. Why not just leave the bass as it is? But the bass as it is wasn't where I wanted it to be in the mix. I made this decision that I wanted the bass to be level, I wanted some more attack, I wanted a little bit more transient information. I lost the low end, so I brought it back with the EQ, and by bringing up the noise floor, I thought to myself, well, how can I get rid of that but still keep my levels and still keep my transients? In goes the noise gate. So go into the noise gate. Focus on the gaps. So I'm going to play it without first and listen to the gaps. You can hear the noise floor coming up and you can hear more finger noise on the bass. And then when I drop the gate in, it subtly gets rid of it. Fast attack, a little bit of a hold, quick release. That way you don't really hear the gate at work. It's just doing its job, which is what you want when you're using a gate in this way. The hard gate preset actually is pretty good in the MPC, and then I've just tweaked it slightly. So listen to the gaps, listen to the spaces. And let's listen to it in the mix. So you can hear it's quite subtle what I've done, but without the effects, the bass kind of gets lost in the drums a little bit. But with the compressor, the EQ and the noise gate, I've brought the bass forward. It sits nicely with the drums. You can hear the bass clearly. You can hear every note clearly as well. Without the effects, some of the notes get lost a little bit because it's quite a fiddly, complicated bass line. But by doing this, I've brought up the levels and I've just leveled it out. But it doesn't sound like it's been over-processed. Right at the end, as I always do, or I do on a lot of instruments, I've had the MPC 60. It gives a nice round low end, a little bit of harmonics in there as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play it without the effects first and just listen to the way that the bass kind of fluctuates and it gets a little bit lost and it sounds a little bit lifeless. Then when I bring in the effects, you can hear that it's leveled it out. The EQ's nice, got a bit of transient information. I can hear what the bass player's doing, but I've still got some nice tight low end as well. Okay, so moving on to the synth bass, I've got a very simple kind of house beat here, 120 BPM, and then I've added a Moog bass over the top. So I'm going to play it without any effects on it first and listen to how the kick and the low end of the drums are kind of battling with the Moog bass. It's quite overwhelming. If it was played on a big system, the low ends, the subs would be flapping around and it would just sound very, very messy. So pretty standard, 4 to the floor, pretty standard Moog bass. So let's go into the effects chain for the Moog bass. Okay, so here you can see very, very quickly, and then I'll go through each one in turn. So again, actually, let's turn those off like that. Again, I start with compression, but it's a different style of compression I want for a Moog bass. It's a synth bass. There's not as much fluctuation in level. It's a lot easier to get the notes all the same. But I do, just because of the inherent nature of fundamentals and harmonics in a bass sound, there are still perceptions in fluctuations of volume, if that makes sense. So again, I do want to use a bit of compression just to give it to perceive it, so that it sounds as if it is level, because it doesn't otherwise. I've got a long attack because I don't really want it to sound too clamped, quite a short release, and quite a gentle ratio, really, nothing too harsh. And I'm not really doing a lot on there, to be honest. What I'm doing with the compression here is kind of almost using it as a shaping tool. So with a very, very small amount of gain reduction, I can still shape the way that the bass sound attacks its transient information, and also its release, the sustain of the bass as well, by adjusting the attack and the release on the compressor, and with the knee as well, and obviously with the ratio. So really what I've done with the bass here is just by using a little bit of compression, I'm kind of I'm tightening the bass up a little bit, if you like. I'm getting rid of some of the boomy low end, and I'm getting rid of some of the boomy, muddy, flappy sustain on the bass as well. So just tightening things up a little bit, a little more. Terrible English, sorry, a little better. Just tightening things up with the bass and just getting it to sit with the kick drum with a beat in a nicer way. Now again, because of a little bit of compression, I am losing a little bit of low end, and I'm using power EQ on this. Because the bass sound is already quite dirty, I don't really want to imprint any more flavour from any EQs, so I've used a transparent EQ. The air power seems to be fairly transparent to my ears. Now, because the kick drum is living at around about 60 Hertz, and I want the kick drum to be the dominant force in the low end on the dance floor, 4 on the floor, house music, I want the kick drum. The kick drum is the fundamental, is the root of the track, and it generally is in house music, 4 to the floor house music anyway. So I'm leaving the kick drum to be 60 Hertz into being that dominant force in the low ends. So with the EQ, I've cut a lot of the low end, out of the bass sound, but also I've rolled off some of the high end as well. You can see that's at 8 kilohertz. Now it looks like 65 Hertz there, and that is what it is, but you have to bear in mind that because of the slope, it's not going to be a brick wall cut off at 65, because you know, like I've just said, I don't want it to be populating 60 Hertz where the kick drum is, but because of the way the slope is at 24, which is actually still quite a harsh slope, I could actually probably have it a little gentler, maybe 18 or 12, but 24 sounded good to me. So although it says 65 Hertz, it's probably rolling the bass off around about 75 to 80, which is where I want it to be. Then I've boosted quite heavily about 80 Hertz, and then at about 110 Hertz as well. Because what I've done there is I've boosted the fundamental of the bass sound, which is around about 80 Hertz, and then I've also boosted some body in the lows as well. And then I've cleared away a little bit of mud at around about 320 Hertz. Sometimes it can be a little bit lower, but on this bass sound it was around about 300 Hertz. And again, that will affect how the sustain sounds in the bass, and I get rid of that flappiness. All of this is tightening it up by pushing up the low cut, but then boosting, I'm creating a tight bass. That's the whole point. And then what I've done up here looks a bit weird maybe, but I am actually boosting a little bit of highs because there's a bit of growl and a bit of grit to the bass. I wanted to bring out a little bit of that, and that follows through into the air flavour. I've got an amp bass set up, but it's at a really, really low level. You can barely hear it, little bit of distortion, mono-fi, full 100%, and it just gives it a bit of grit, just a little bit more grit, and I'm emphasizing some of the harmonics that are higher up on the bass sound, and therefore it helps cut through the mix on smaller sound systems, phones, computers, not so much cars because they tend to have a bit of low end. So by adding a bit of distortion or saturation to the bass sound, and this is a common thing, it's not something I've just invented or anything, you are increasing the perceived sound of the bass, which will cut through on sound systems that don't have subs, don't have low end. So that's what I've done with this, but it's very, very, very subtle. You can actually hear from this, it's going to be difficult to hear unless you're using headphones that have got a nice bit of low end on them, or you've got some monitors set up with some subs. But it doesn't really sound initially, especially if you're not listening on a good sound system, that there's much going on with the bass. I haven't really done very much. It just sort of pretty much sounds the same. But what I've done is I've tightened it up, and that is super important. Flappy, uncontrolled bass against the kick drum on music like this, drum and bass, house music, EDM, anything like that, even hip hop, you don't want your bass to be flappy and clashing with the kick drum. So it's small adjustments that you make to the frequency range and the transient information and some of the harmonics, saturation, distortion, that kind of thing. It's just very, very small adjustments that you're going to make that are going to bring your bass from sounding flappy and uncontrolled and boomy to sounding low end, tight and punchy, which is what I want from this. Moogs have a lot of loose, flappy, low end on them, especially if they're being overdriven. And what you need to do with basses like this and synth basses in general is you want to tighten them up. You still want the oomph to be there, but you want it to be punchy. Or that's the decision I've made for this song. Maybe you do want it to be flappy and all over the place, and that's your decision, in which case don't do any of the things that I've just said. But if you want it to be punchy and you want it to sit nicely with the kick drum but still have some low end and some body, then these adjustments work for that. Again, they are very, very subtle. Now, the final part of the puzzle is something that we all know if we use the MPC, using the mother ducker, and it's being activated by the kick drum. It's very subtle. I'm not doing an awful lot with it. You can see it just flicking there. You see, even a minor adjustment just makes it too much. It's making it duck too much. So I just want it chopped out the way of the kick drum. I don't want it, on this particular track, I don't want it that real kind of like wavy, pumpy sound. I literally just want it cut away. I don't want people to hear the mother ducker. What I want it to do is to take the low end of the bass out when the kick drum is there, so they're not populating the mix at the same time, basically. And that's the point here. Mother ducker isn't always about ducking it. I mean, I love that sound. I love that French disco sound. I love that lo-fi sound, you know, the SP303, that kind of tight compression with a duck in and that kind of thing. But mother ducker doesn't have to be always used for that. It can sometimes just be used subtly just to dip something out of the way in the mix. And that's what I've done here. It's just ducking with the kick drum, but not in a pumpy way. I've done that by the way I've set up the attack and the release. I've taken auto off. Remember, auto is off and on by default. Well, it is on by default. So take off auto so that you have access to the release and the attack. And the ratio, it's quite subtle, you know, but what I want to do is I just kind of want to round things off on the way that it's ducking, but not too much, you know. That's why it's quite a quick release, and I'm letting through some of the transient information. You can just, I think what you can hear the most is that they're more married with each other. The drums and the bass, they sound like they're supposed to live in the same house with each other. They don't live at opposite ends of the street, which is what it sounds like without the compression and the EQ and the harmonics and the mother duck are on there. So again, it's subtle, but I've just brought things together by using this chain, like, you know, in this way. And that was my aim. My aim was to get the bass and the drums to sit together, not clash with each other, but help each other. You know, you've still got that nice groove, you've still got that nice low end. So let's just listen to it again without, and listen to how it just sort of, the bass is kind of going, and then when I bring it in, the bass is just sat with the kick and sat with the drums nicely. So there you have it. Now, as I said, an important part of mixing is to be able to step away and decide on what your objectives are, decide on what your goals are. And then you have more focus, and you know, you can head in the direction that you've set yourself. It's very easy to become completely overwhelmed when you're in there and you've got all these plugins and all these sounds being thrown at you. It's overwhelming. But if you have some focus, if you step away and you decide, it's especially important with the drums and the bass, in my opinion, because those two need to be married. They need to sit with each other because they bridge the gap between the rhythm and the melody and the harmony. And you want them to be tight and you want them to work together and to sound good together. So I hope this has helped. I'm going to upload the effects chain, which you can download and use yourself. But as I said, do remember that there's a million different bass sounds, and it's not going to work exactly the same way on your bass as it has worked on my bass. So you can use that chain and use the idea behind it, but you're going to have to dial it in yourself to get it to work with your bass. So thank you for watching. Please subscribe for more mixing, mastering and MPC tutorials and reviews. This is the Crates Motel. My name's Conan. Till next time.